From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Donald Trump agrees to 3 September debates with Kamala Harris, announced in a more than hour-long news conference at Mar-a-Lago today, while Harris and her running mate Tim Walz continue their swing state blitz today in Michigan and Arizona.
We'll have reaction this hour from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi of Illinois and Republican Congressman James Comer of Kentucky, the chair of the House Oversight Committee, will join us.
We'll also be joined today by Melinda Haring of the Atlantic Council as Ukraine mounts its biggest incursion into Russia since the start of the war. An important headline, Kaylee, that may well come up in a debate. It looks like we're going to have at least one here in this presidential campaign.
Yep, on September 10th on ABC. That is the one that we understand at this hour Vice President Harris has agreed to.
Yes.
The other two, we're not quite sure yet.
Well, as Donald Trump said in an interview earlier this week, it takes two to tango. And we have not heard, indeed, from the Harris campaign on all of these, but indeed near the top of his roughly hour-long news conference, Donald Trump did get into this. Here he is.
So I just look forward to these debates. I think it's very important that we have them. I hope she agrees to them September 4th, September 10th, September 25th. And I think they'll be very revealing. CBS is going to do the vice presidential debate.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Mike Dorning. So, Mike, I guess we all have at least one date on our calendars to mark. We weren't totally sure that this was going to happen. But it is worth noting he announced this during a press conference at Mar-a-Lago as his campaign is trying to call attention to the fact that at this time, the vice president isn't taking a lot of questions from the press.
Yeah, that's one of the attacks he's mounted on her. I don't think that it really matters that much at this point. She's rolling out her introduction of herself to the country in a controlled way, but that will be a line of attack that if she doesn't at some point start to engage more after the convention, it will start to resonate with people.
Interesting that we could have as many as 3. What would compel either of them to go into the ring 3 times?
Well, I think there's a good argument on both sides for going more than once, because then you have time to recover if you have a bad debate. And that's originally why President Biden agreed to 2 debates, so that everything wasn't riding on one. It turns out that didn't work for him to have time to recover. But you could see potentially Harris agreeing to the 3rd debate. I would have a hard time believing that she would agree to Fox debate, much less a Fox debate, before anything else.
Well, we didn't hear from her, as we said, on those other 2 today. But shortly after Donald Trump's press conference, she was holding a campaign rally in Michigan. Here's a bit of what she had to say.
I am so deeply honored as a lifelong supporter of union labor for Tim and I to have the endorsement of UAW. Because you walk your walk. You walk your walk.
This, of course, is part of their swing across the swing states, Mike, in which they are very much focusing on labor, it seems, trying to target that blue wall, even as we're seeing some polling, or at least pollsters suggesting they think the Sun Belt could be more in play as well.
Yeah, absolutely. They're playing in all 6 of the true swing states. They're less focused on the northern 3 than Biden was, because they actually have a shot in all of them. But labor is critical to any Democratic presidential candidate. Now you have here a presidential and a vice presidential candidate who have strong ties to labor, and that's important to get those blue-collar workers over that have been trending towards Republicans.
All right, Mike, thank you so much. As always, Bloomberg's Mike Dorning helping us get going this evening. And joining us now to further the conversation is Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, who is with us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Congressman, welcome back. It's always great to have you here. If we could first just talk about some of the language we are hearing from Donald Trump. And it was not just today in his news conference, but we've seen him repeatedly be talking about things like the racial identity of the vice president. He suggested today he doesn't care if it's Indian or black, but it's disrespectful to suggest it is both or to switch between the two. And I wonder, sir, if you have a reaction to that.
Yeah, I think it's disrespectful for him to comment on this in the way he has. I think that I read that almost 40 million Americans are of some kind of multiracial background, and they describe themselves that way. They should have the freedom to talk about themselves in the way in which they feel comfortable. But for some reason, Donald Trump thinks that he's the decider in chief of people's identities and gets to redefine it for them. That won't play well. That's why he is unfit to be president again. And that's, I think, a comment that will, along with his other comments, will go on to haunt him in this campaign.
Well, he said a lot today. We covered the better part of an hour with Donald Trump, and he also spoke to conditions with regard to crime and security in your town of Chicago. He was actually being asked about gun control, gun legislation, Congressman, at the time. Here's what Donald Trump said, and we'll have you respond.
And remember this, what is the toughest gun law in the United States? Chicago. On July 4th, 117 people were shot and 17 died. The toughest gun laws in the United States are in the city of Chicago. You know that. They had 117 people shot. Afghanistan does not have that.
So he compared the city of Chicago today to Afghanistan as all of us prepare to pack our bags to attend the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Will it be possible to secure the city for this event? Is he right about what he's saying?
Chicago will be a wonderful place to come for the Democratic National Convention. I urge everyone to come for an excellent time. And I think that at the end of the day, the problem, one of the biggest problems that we have with regard to gun violence is that we don't have national laws that police against, for instance, the trafficking of guns that you can easily purchase in other states and bring to places like Chicago or other places with common sense gun control. I'm just chagrined that Mr. Trump would forget that just a few weeks ago, he was almost assassinated by someone with an AR-15 style rifle that should not be allowed to be purchased by a civilian. It's a weapon of war that almost killed him. And so I would hope that he would have a different approach on this issue, but unfortunately he does not.
Well, Congressman, it is worth pointing out that Donald Trump did take many questions from the media at Mar-a-Lago today. He and J.D. Vance have criticized the vice president for not doing so. When is it time for her to sit down for an interview or to hold a news conference like he did today?
Oh, she's going to have a lot of news conferences in the weeks and months to come. I think right now, as your previous guest had mentioned, I think she's introducing herself to the public as the presidential nominee for our party. A convention is coming up, and I think there will be plenty of time for her to do press conferences now and in the future. But right now, I think what Donald Trump is really trying to do is deflect attention from her campaign because he knows that she has the momentum and she is gaining in the polls and he doesn't like it. And so he's trying to redirect attention away and distract from what is obviously a successful campaign by Kamala Harris.
Well, one of the things they've been directing us to, Congressman, is Tim Walz's military record, questioning his service. We heard about this from J.D. Vance yesterday, and the messaging from the Trump campaign suggested he abandoned his men before they deployed to Iraq when he went to run for Congress, that he lied about serving in combat, referring to a weapon he was holding in a gun control ad, that it was a weapon that he held in war, and that he inflated his rank. This has upset a lot of people, Congressman, on both sides of the aisle, some of whom find this type of criticism of someone's service inappropriate. And I wonder if you think he should talk about it.
Look, I think that the fact of the matter is that Tim Walz served for 24 years in the National Guard. He became an enlisted man at the age of 17. He trained numerous people on how to use their weapons for combat, and many of them did serve in conflict. And so for anybody to question his service, plus, by the way, he was the ranking member of the Veterans Affairs Committee when I served with him in the House. He's passionate about serving veterans. And so at some point he will speak about these particular, ridiculous attacks. But I think it's the height of hypocrisy for Donald Trump, who, deferred serving because of bone spurs, to then criticize someone who served for more than 2 decades in the armed forces of our country.
Well, Congressman, as you mentioned that he was the ranking member of the Veterans Affairs Committee, you are the ranking member of the China Select Committee currently. And something else we know about Governor Walz's resume is that he used to teach in China. He speaks Mandarin. Do you have an understanding of what kind of policy in regard to China he would bring to a future Harris-Walz administration?
I think that he, and of course, our future president, Kamala Harris, I think will probably bring a lot of continuity to the Biden administration's policies with regard to China, which have been very tough and smart, not only with regard to military issues, but also with regard to economic and technological ones. And so I feel very comfortable with where they're going and their approach. And for that matter, I think we should continue to adopt a bipartisan approach with regard to China, because at the end of the day, what China really wants to see is a schism between Democrats and Republicans so they can then continue to play one side off against the other.
Congressman, thanks for joining. As always, Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, ranking member of the China Select Committee. Good to have you back on Bloomberg. Coming up, we'll turn to the war in Ukraine and an important development today with Ukraine's reported 1,000-person incursion into Russian territory now underway. Melinda Haring, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, is up next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
As far as the specifics on that, I would refer you to the Ukrainians to speak about their own military operations. That's where I would refer you to. But we are, generally speaking, as you know, we have been supportive of Ukraine as they are defending themselves against Russia's aggression.
Karine Jean-Pierre, White House press secretary, speaking yesterday as Ukrainian fighters now have taken the battle into Russia in an incursion that is now in its 3rd day, according at least to the Russian Defense Ministry. Joining us here live is Melinda Haring, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Melinda, it's great to see you. Welcome back. I know you were just in Lviv not that long ago, and your on-the-ground experience there really speaks to what's going on right now. 3 days in the making. Are we going to look back at this as a turning point in the war?
I'm not sure yet. So we don't have a lot of information. It's murky still. This is the 3rd day, but it is a big deal. It's the largest force of Ukrainian soldiers going into Russia since the war started, more than 900 days since the war started. So there's a couple of things that I would watch. There's 4 different brigades that the Ukrainians have used. We don't know the numbers. The Russians are saying 1,000 to 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers are there. And I think everyone's struggling to understand why now and what the purpose behind it is. And there's a couple of guesses.
Well, what are your guesses here? Is this Ukraine actually trying to take control of Russian territory? Are they trying to take out Russian capabilities that emanate from here? Like, what exactly is the end game?
Kaylee, so what a difference a day makes. Yesterday, the Financial Times ran a story that basically said everything is terrible in Ukraine. The fighting is getting really, really hard in the Donbass, right? That was yesterday. And then today, everyone is jubilant. So we've seen a complete change in headlines. The Ukrainians have decided that they're not just going to sit there and wait and be assaulted and sit in a defensive position. So part of it is showing momentum and showing the West what they can do. We see images on social media of the Ukrainians using German armored vehicles and American armored vehicles. So it's partly a message to the West.
Well, that's important. What's the U.S.'s philosophy then? Is it evolving on the use of American-provided weapons offensively against Russia?
Not so far. So that's something that I would be watching. There was pressure on the Biden administration to lift the restrictions that they put in place. And as you know, in May and June, we saw a horrible humanitarian crisis in Kharkiv, that city up in northeastern Ukraine. And finally, the Biden administration relented a little bit. But most of the targets, more than 80% of the targets that Ukraine would like to strike, are still off limits.
So is there a risk here that the Ukrainians, if they want to continue with this incursion, are going to run into direct conflict with what U.S. policy is, and that we could see some friction? Or do you think it's more likely that U.S. policy would adjust in order for the Ukrainians to do what they need to do with what they've started?
So both the Defense Department and the White House have said, we support this. And the Germans said that as well. And the White House is being a little legalistic. They're saying, look, it's completely fine if the Ukrainians use our weapon systems because the attack originated from a place where the Russians have used our weapons before. So it's in line with the policy. They're taking a very legalistic approach to it. The Germans took a more open-ended approach. They said, when we give the Ukrainians weapons, they're Ukrainian weapons. And under international law, both parties both Russia and Ukraine are party to this conflict. So go ahead and defend your territory.
The way it's qualified from the White House, in this case through John Kirby, that this type of action is restricted to target imminent threats just across the border. You could call a lot of things an imminent threat. Are we to believe that Ukraine was about to be attacked from that side of the border?
So, Joe, that's another one of the theories, is that Ukraine knew that this attack was coming, that there was an imminent attack coming from Russia. Yeah. And rather than just waiting, they went in and nipped it in the butt. We don't know yet. And the Ukrainian side is being very quiet for operational reasons, as they should be.
Well, of course, you have a lot more insight into Ukrainian thinking and, frankly, what it's like on the ground than most. You were just in Ukraine for weeks. What did you see? What did it tell you about where exactly we are in this war?
So we're about 900 days in, and everyone is worried about winter. The discussions are about how hard winter is going to be, and everyone I know is preparing. So they have a plan A, B, and C, and they're preparing batteries in their homes to keep their apartments going when there's blackouts. And there's already tremendous blackouts. So in the city of Kiev, the capital, there's 2 hours of power in the morning and 2 hours of power at night. It's really hard to run a business. It's really hard to have children. There's no air conditioning, right? And it's really hot. There was 100-degree weather there. I was studying, and I found myself studying by candlelight, often at night. I would take a shower, and the power would be cut. Now, I was in Lviv, which is Disneyland. It's great. But the further east you go, the more difficult it is. So everyone's focused on winter. And I kept asking mayors, energy officials, how bad is it going to be this winter? And no one knows. It depends on the temperature and how severe the strikes are from the Russian side.
We saw, lastly, Melinda, images of F-16s flying over Ukraine. At last, President Zelensky got his F-16s. Was that for show, or can they actually be used effectively in this war?
So it is a victory that Ukraine has F-16s. The number is under 10, and it's not going to be a game changer. We waited way too long to get them F-16s. We haven't given them a sufficient number. And the way that the front line is arrayed now, they're going to play defense. They're going to shoot down Russian missiles. Russia has its air defenses out on the front, and it will shoot down F-16s if the Ukrainians try to put these F-16s too far out in front. So it's good, it's insufficient, and it won't be a game changer.
All right, Melinda, it's always great
Welcome
to get
back.
the reality check
you.
from you. We appreciate it. Melinda Haring, Eurasia Center Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. And coming up, we'll take a look at former Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin's call to kill the 20-year Treasury bond that he revived just 4 years ago. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I feel the president should have at least say in there. Yeah, I feel that strongly. I think that in my case, I made a lot of money. I was very successful, and I think I have a better instinct than, in many cases, people that would be on the Federal Reserve or the chairman.
That was Donald Trump earlier today, where he said he believes that the president should have some say over monetary policy. But today we're also keeping watch on fiscal policy, specifically when it comes to the Treasury and the issuing of government debt of different maturities. Stephen Mnuchin, the former U.S. Treasury Secretary, recently made headlines saying that it's time to kill the 20-year Treasury bond that he revived just 4 years ago. Here to help explain from New York is one of the reporters who has been following this story, Bloomberg's Ye. So, obviously it was Steve Mnuchin's idea to bring the 20-year back. Now he thinks it needs to go away. Why?
Because the 20-year bond has been consistently trading as the highest yields on the yield curve. It means that it's very expensive for the government to sell the bonds on the 20-year point. We calculated that the government essentially overpaid probably $2 billion a year issuing the 20-year bonds when we compare to the average cost of 10-year and 30-year bonds. It doesn't sound like a lot of money in the context of the huge government deficit. The annual government spending is close to $7 trillion. But $2 billion is $2 billion. That's a lot of money. Money can be well spent in a lot of other things, such as national parks or veteran housing, etc. So Steve Mnuchin, as you mentioned, that is the Treasury Secretary that brought back the 20-year bonds. At a time during the pandemic, the government was looking for ways to lock in very low interest rates by selling long-term bonds. According to Mnuchin, that it fulfilled the original goal, but it's been 4 years and it's still very expensive for the government to sell. So he thinks it's the time to kill it.
Why does the disconnect? With the rest of the Treasury market exist to begin with?
Yeah, it's a very, according to some bond experts, it's kind of a weird point on the Treasury curve because when we compare to the 10-year, it's not as liquid as 10-year. And when compared to 30 years, has a unique feature. They have a lot of interest rate risks, a lot of long duration. Pension funds, insurance company, or even hedge fund like to trading that. So 20 years is just in between. When it first sold in 1980s, it only lasted 4 or 5 years because they didn't have sufficient demand or consistent investment demand. So they killed 40 years ago, and Mnuchin brought it back. Now there's a debate ongoing whether we should keep it or kill it.
Bloomberg's Ye, we thank you so much for the expertise on this fascinating story, and you can read a lot more about it on the terminal and online. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kayleigh Lyons in Washington. And Kayleigh, interesting that we heard from Donald Trump on the Fed today. Spoke about it actually at length in that news conference, suggesting indeed that he wants to say in interest rates.
Yeah, and of course we know how he feels about interest rates by and large, at least during his administration. He wanted them lower.
Yeah, get ready for the tweets. Coming up, we'll look at the House Oversight Committee's probe into Kamala Harris's involvement with the border. Republican Congressman James Comer is next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and Radio.
If Trump loses, I'm not confident at all. He means what he says. We don't take him seriously. He means it. All the stuff about if we lose, there'll be a bloodbath. It's have to be a stolen election. Look what they're trying to do now in the local election districts where people count the votes. They're elected, they're putting people in place in states that they're going to count the votes, right? You can't love your country only when you win.
President Biden had an interview with CBS News in which he shared concerns about political violence around this upcoming election. Then earlier today, Donald Trump was asked about that idea, whether he thinks there'll be a peaceful response to the election results. Here's what he said.
Of course there'll be a peaceful transfer, and there was last time, and there'll be a peaceful transfer. I just hope we're going to have honest elections. That's all. Okay?
Joining us now on Bloomberg TV and Radio is Republican Congressman James Comer of Kentucky, of course, chair of the House Oversight Committee. Mr. Chairman, welcome back to Bloomberg. It's good to see you, sir. As someone who was evacuated from the House floor and described January 6th as a dark day in the history of America, I wonder if you share those concerns about political violence around this election.
No, I don't think there's going to be political violence this election. I think that what the concerns in the last election, unfortunately, were pertaining to mailing universal ballots and who was voting these people. I mean, I live in Appalachia, and every election that's ever been contested in the history of Southeast Kentucky pertain to loose absentee balloting rules. And I think now the balloting rules have been tightened. There's no COVID, so there's no need to mail universal ballots to every registered voter on the voter list in America. If you want an absentee ballot, then vote absentee. My daughter's going to vote absentee because she's going to be on a vacation during that time, a long vacation. So request the ballot. And I think that was the problem with the last election. That's why so many Republicans were concerned about the integrity of our voting. I believe that's been solved. I'm confident that the states of Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, where the most questions arose the last election, I'm confident those problems have been solved, and I'm confident there's going to be a peaceful transfer of power.
Well, Mr. Chairman, you may believe that about the actual changing from President Biden to President whomever, but we have already seen political violence in this election cycle with the attempted assassination of Donald Trump last month. Oversight obviously launched an investigation into that. What's next for the committee, and how does it dovetail with the bipartisan task force that has now been set up by the Speaker and Democratic leader?
I think what the bipartisan task force is going to do is try to determine the exact failures, who's to blame. They're going to focus in on the shooter. Did the shooter act alone? Those sorts of things. Where my committee has legislative jurisdiction is over the Secret Service. And this committee has had a long history of investigating the Secret Service, dating back to Elijah Cummings and Jason Chaffetz when they were chair. There's been a concern for over a decade in the Oversight Committee by Republicans and Democrats that the Secret Service was lax in their training requirements and their hiring requirements. And they had always had a bad scorecard with respect to morale among government employees. So we want to fix the problem. We look forward to hearing what the bipartisan task force concludes. And we want to try to make sure that this never happens again. Well, I want President Biden to be safe. I want Kamala Harris to be safe. And I want Donald Trump to be safe. And we shouldn't have to worry about that. But right now, I don't think very many people have confidence that the Secret Service can protect those people. So we want to fix the problem. And that's the role the House Oversight Committee will play.
Well, I know that you're busy on the Oversight Committee with this matter. Congressman, I wonder if you're planning to pursue, as has been reported, the idea of sending a subpoena to Kamala Harris or other members of the Biden administration for covering up, as it's been suggested, Joe Biden's mental acuity that led him out of this race.
Well, we certainly believe there was a cover-up. I don't think anyone's ever said anything about subpoenaing the vice president or anything like that. We have subpoenaed staffers. We've identified 3 staffers, as well as the White House physician, that we believe, according to press reports in the New York Times and other mainstream media outlets, were the ones that were the gatekeepers, the ones that were protecting Joe Biden from meeting with his cabinet, the ones that were shielding Joe Biden from the press, the ones that were escorting Joe Biden on and off the plane and in and out of the White House. We want to see exactly when the president's health started deteriorating and exactly what they did to try to conceal that. So I don't think very many people in America would dispute the fact that the president has been in declining health. The question is for how long? And the big concern in our committee is, was there a shadow government? Is Joe Biden incoherent completely? We don't know. But if so, who was calling the shots? Was there a shadow government? I think that's an issue of national security, and I think that's a question that a lot of Americans in both parties have.
Do you have enough evidence of that, sir, that we will actually see a hearing in regard to this matter? Is there enough there? How does it move forward?
Well, we're certainly hoping that the White House staffers will honor their subpoena. I assume that'll be going to court. We have a lot of subpoenas outstanding that are unfortunately being slow walked through court. So certainly this is something that we're not going to let up on. We certainly want to know exactly what circumstances evolved around the concealment of the president's poor health. And certainly, you look at the doctor. The doctor issued a statement just a few months prior to Joe Biden dropping out of the presidential election, stating that he was in perfect health. And I think we've seen Nancy Pelosi and other leaders who have regularly met with Joe Biden say, no, he's not in good enough health. He's not in good enough health to serve 4 more years as president. So we have a lot of questions, and hopefully our subpoenas will be upheld in the courts now, because every subpoena I've issued, to my knowledge, in the private sector has been honored. The subpoenas that I have trouble with are the ones in the Biden administration. This has not been a transparent administration, and I'm not going to shed too many tears in January when they walk out of the White House.
Well, and of course, we don't have evidence of a cover-up here, but we do want to hear what you learn, Mr. Chairman. At the same time, I wonder if you're not going to subpoena Kamala Harris on that issue, do you in fact want to question the vice president about her role as the so-called border czar in this administration?
We have a lot of questions. I mean, the so-called border czar was what Joe Biden called her, the border czar. So, I don't think anyone.
Well, it's not an official title. I think we understand each other.
Well, I don't agree with that. I believe she is the border czar. And at the end of the day, the southern border is a disaster. We've had a wide open border for the entire 4 years. People are invited to come to the United States without any consequences when they come over here illegally. And I think that that's bad. I think that's been a drain on the taxpayers, on Medicaid, on our public health, on our crime. Fentanyl certainly has poured into this country across the southern border. So we want to know who's to blame for that, because we've got to fix the southern border. So with respect to subpoenas, I've never said anything about subpoenaing the vice president or the president. It's very difficult to subpoena the president or vice president. I would hope that the media will question Kamala Harris about what exact role she played on the border and why she didn't step up to secure the border. If she wasn't the border czar, she was still vice president. Why didn't she express outrage or concern that millions and millions of people were walking across the border illegally?
Well, we do hope we'll have the chance to ask some questions of the vice president at some point here on Bloomberg, Congressman, Mr. Chairman. But obviously, we get to ask questions of you now. I would like to focus on one thing in particular that you put out before the recess. It was a report on the three big PBMs, pharmacy benefits managers. Obviously, there have been a lot of bipartisan ideas as to how to overhaul PBMs. What legislatively do you think we can expect, if anything, from this Congress? Are these companies that need to be broken up?
Absolutely. I'm a Republican. I'm all about making money. I'm a conservative. I believe the government needs to get off the backs of the private sector. But we've got a problem with pharmaceutical prices in America. People that need prescription drugs are having to pay too much for prescription drugs. I think that's somewhere where we have bipartisan agreement. The PBMs are called, their pharmacy benefit managers were created to be the middleman, created to help negotiate the price of drugs, to make drugs cheaper. But what's happened over time is the PBMs have been purchased by the insurance companies who have purchased the pharmaceutical, the pharmacies now. So they're vertically integrated, and they're actually gouging consumers as opposed to saving consumers money. And we believe that these PBMs need to be broken up. We believe they need to be held accountable for overbilling Medicare, Medicaid. You're seeing states, blue states and red states alike, pass legislation to rein in the PBMs. And I think that Congress should do a lot more. We have jurisdiction on the Oversight Committee with the federal health insurance plan. We've already passed legislation reining in the PBMs on the federal health insurance plan. But the two committees of jurisdiction that have broad jurisdiction over reining in the PBMs altogether are the House Ways and Means Committee and the House Energy and Commerce Committee. They've yet to do a whole lot on PBMs, and our investigation, I think, has shined a light on the abuses. That's that report that we issued. Katie Porter, Raj Krishnamoorthi, these are Democrat members from California and Illinois, respectively. They were all in with us on this investigation, on this report. It's very bipartisan, and we believe that the PBMs are one reason that healthcare is unaffordable in the United States.
All right. Well, we'll look to see further progress in this area to come. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for joining us here on Bloomberg. We appreciate your time, sir. That's Republican Congressman James Comer of Kentucky, the chair of the House Oversight Committee. And coming up, we'll turn to our political panel. They'll take a swing at former President Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago press conference earlier today. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
She's not doing any news conference. You know why she's not doing it? Because she can't do a news conference. She doesn't know how to do a news conference. She's not smart enough to do a news conference. And I have to tell you, J.D. Vance has really stepped up. He's doing a fantastic job. So I think the abortion issue has been very much tempered down. Anybody that votes for them, if you're Jewish or if you love Israel, you have to have your head examined. There's certainly never been anybody so liberal like these two.
That was former President Donald Trump speaking with reporters at Mar-a-Lago earlier today. The news conference offered Trump an opportunity to take back some of the spotlight after almost a full week of headlines from the Harris and Walz campaign. Joining us now for more here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio is our political panel. Brittany Martinez, Republican strategist at Espina and Company and founder and CEO there, and Pat Dennis, American Bridge 21st Century president. So this was a more than hour-long affair down in Florida this evening. At the very least, Donald Trump was taking questions from the press, something we haven't seen the vice president do much of, and that maybe was part of this point. But did you watch the whole thing, Brittany? Did he help his own case?
No, I don't think he did. And when it comes to the point that you made about the vice president not having taken questions, I definitely think that she needs to, like ASAP. I think they're still on the Biden path where they're trying to compare him to Biden and his ability or inability to be standing and talking for a long time. But this isn't the case anymore. You're running against someone who is almost 20 years younger. And that, seeing who has the stamina, I don't think that that's helpful. And it just shows once again that he doesn't have the ability to stay on message.
Well, it's clear what we do for a living. We think everyone should sit down for interviews every day.
Yes.
That's the way we would have it in our perfect world. But we try to put ourselves in the minds of those running the campaign, Pat. Who's actually asking, who's demanding news conferences? We go through this a lot. And is it me, or is it the voter, or is it both?
I mean, the thing about when you're running for president, time is the most precious resource, sure, right? And you see these rallies she's doing. She's building connections. She's, dealing with the UAW. She's got a lot on her plate right now. But there absolutely will be a time to sit down, do long-form interviews.
But if you've packaged this perfect honeymoon here and you know it's going to last the next 2 weeks going through the convention, why would you do an interview?
Well, I mean, that's going to ultimately be up to her, and we'll see whether or not she does. But she's got plenty of campaigning to do. So, you'll see going into the convention whether or not, I think coming out of there, after she's made her case one-on-one to the American people, then she can go one-on-one with journalists. Mm-hmm.
Well, she also is going to go one-on-one against Donald Trump on a debate. At least one confirmed. Remember, he announced in this news conference today he's agreed to 3. Fox on September 4th, ABC on September 10th, and then NBC on September 25th. Here's what the vice president had to say in return.
I'm glad that he's finally agreed to a debate on September 10th. I'm looking forward to it and hope he shows up. I am happy to have that conversation about an additional debate for after September 10th, for sure.
So it seems, Brittany, that she's not super eager to do the debate on Fox on September 4th. As we consider whether or not we're going to see all 3 or just one happen, to what extent do you believe that if that Fox debate were to happen first, that September 10th debate would actually happen?
That's a good question. I think that for Trump's benefit, obviously, he would want Fox to come first. But I think that, if that's what they end up deciding, that they need to go ahead and do it. Also, if you guys recall last week when he was at NABJ at the summit, he said to the ABC journalists, you guys want to have me do a debate and now I'm not going to, right? And so, and now he's done a total 180. So I wouldn't be surprised if he does another 180 again and he says, well, you know what, I'm going to do Fox and afterwards not. So I think there's definitely always a possibility that perhaps that would be the only one. But if the vice president continues to put pressure on him, I think we'll continue to see at least 2 debates, hopefully the 3.
Well, I think it's interesting that you have one candidate announcing a deal on 3. I think it takes both campaigns to make these agreements, right? There's all kinds of fine print. You talk about whether we're standing or sitting, what the rules are, whether there's an audience, what the location is, as Donald Trump said himself today, and none of that has been established yet. If you're advising Kamala Harris, do you say yes to every one of these challenges?
So it's hard to go wrong. I think if you look at this press conference that happened today, it's the perfect example of why Donald Trump should not be up in front of a camera in front of the American people. He steps on his own words. He says things that are completely out of left field, and he raises questions about his ability to serve as president. And he's gotten more tired. He's gotten slower as time has gone on. So I'm in favor of putting this guy in front of as many cameras as possible for Election Day, but ultimately that'll be a decision for the campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and as we consider getting in front of cameras as much as possible, it is worth pointing out that we had a 2-hour-long program, essentially, this week announcing this Harris-Walz ticket in which they had media coverage because it was announced not at the convention, like was the case for Donald Trump. We also will be at the DNC covering this campaign quite extensively, as we did with what became the Trump-Vance campaign in Milwaukee at the RNC. Is this going to turn out, when we do a post-mortem on this summer, to be a huge miscalculation by the Donald Trump campaign in terms of the ability to capture maximum airtime?
You know what? I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, one thing that we know about Donald Trump is that he loves talking about the numbers and the figures. Today, during the press conference, he spent half the time saying, "Well, the amount of people at my rallies is more."
The inauguration
7 years ago, right? I mean,
it's more than Martin Luther King.
Yes, thank you. And so it's so ridiculous. So I think that he's spiraling. I think that's what we've seen since the last week. I mean,
so you saw a panicked Donald Trump.
I saw a panicked Donald Trump for sure. And then I saw some interviews of some of his former people. I said, look, you can tell from his mannerisms, the way he's playing the accordion. I thought that was a really fun little way to describe that, talking about the size of the crowds. So I agree with you 100%. I mean, I think every time he's extensively in front of the camera, we see these gaffes. But I think that he can't help himself, and I think he'll continue to do those press conferences.
Well, there's more where this came from. Our panel will stay with us ahead as we look at the Trump-Vance tickets attacks on the military service of Governor Tim Walz. Is this the new swift boating of 2024? It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I wonder, Tim Walz, when were you ever in war? What was this weapon that you carried into war, given that you abandoned your unit right before they went to Iraq, and he has not spent a day in a combat zone? What bothers me about Tim Walz is the stolen valor garbage. Do not pretend to be something that you're not. And if he wants to criticize me for getting an Ivy League education, I'm proud of the fact that my mamaw supported me, that I was able to make something of myself. I'd be ashamed if I was him and I lied about my military service like he did.
Republican vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance, the senator, today talking about his Democratic opponent's service record. Back with us, our political panel now. Brittany, Martinez, Pat Dennis. Stolen valor is a very heavy charge here. Pat, they're talking about abandoning his men before they deployed to Iraq when he ran for Congress, lying about serving in combat, the reference to the gun there, and inflating his rank. Does the Harris-Walz campaign respond or not?
I mean, I will tell you, this is a desperate attack, right? This is a guy who served for 24 years as an enlisted man. The amount of sacrifice involved in that is incredible. And what they're doing right here just like turns people off. It looks like a political attack. Somebody like J.D. Vance up there saying it in this way, running this like attempted John Kerry playbook. It doesn't seem authentic. And their candidate dodged the draft. Like President Bone Spurs here. So it's not going to work out for them. This is the first thing they landed on, and it's not going to go anywhere.
Brittany, would love the Republicans' take on this. Is this a missed opportunity to actually be hitting the governor on, say, policy?
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with you 100%. I am so grateful to anyone who serves our country and, whether currently enlisted or a veteran, I'm so grateful, including the senator. But, if you want to go tit for tat, he was enlisted for 4 years where J.D. Vance, he was enlisted for 4 years where Walz was enlisted for 24 years, right? And not to mention Trump dodged the draft 5 times. So I don't know that they are the messengers on this issue.
I was really taken by the response from Senator Mark Kelly, who, of course, didn't need to weigh in right now. He was on the short list, didn't get picked to be running mate. But, of course, we're talking about a former Navy fighter pilot here, not to mention a NASA astronaut. Quote, "You both deserve to be thanked for your service," he said. "Don't become Donald Trump. He calls veterans suckers and losers, and that is beneath those of us who have actually served," unquote. You're the daughter of a veteran. I say we thank both of them for their service today.
Yeah, thank them all.
Yeah,
thank you, Daddy, if you're watching at home. All right, Brittany Martinez and Pat Dennis, thank you both as well. Always great to have you, our political panel this evening, as we cover another busy day in politics. Of course, now the Harris-Walz campaign is moving from Detroit to Arizona.
Yes, indeed.
As the swing state tour continues, and we expect to see Donald Trump in Montana tomorrow after that news conference today. You can get full coverage, of course, in the Washington edition newsletter, on the terminal, and online.
Thanks for spending time with us today on Balance of Power. We've got one more in us this week, and we'll meet you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.